The Washington Post's Pulitzer Prize-winning article on drug abuse is discovered to be a hoax.
Early this morning, Ms. Cook told us that major parts of the story that won the award were fabricated and that she did not interview an 8-year-old heroin addict. In the morning, all of us collectively will apologize in the paper to the readers of the Post.
Whatever else you could argue about 1981, it was unquestionably a year of great worldwide violence. And sad to say, much of that violence was aimed squarely at our world leaders. Early in the year, President Reagan addressed the AFL-CIO in Washington. He couldn't know that the words he was speaking would only moments later become translated into a bloody reality.
Government's first duty is to protect the people, not run their lives. What have been some of the results of this straying from basic principles? Well, for one, violent crime has surged 10%, making neighborhood streets unsafe and families fearful in their homes.
He complained that I had hurt his ribs in landing on top of him. Shortly after that, I would say in a space of 10 to 15 seconds, he complained of problem in breathing. He was getting a bit ashen in color. And then he started coughing up a little blood. It was bright red, and I knew from my training that this was oxygenated blood. This is the blood coming out of the lung. I told the driver immediately to head for George Washington, which we did.
I have seen throughout the day the reaction of other members of the family. Mine is fury and rage and anger, and that in this country, this kind of garbage still goes on, and it is not going to happen to this president. By God, it is not going to happen to this president.
The hours following the shooting were fraught with anguish, tension, and one genuinely awkward moment.
Right now, who's making the decisions?
Constitutionally, gentlemen, you have the president, the vice president, and the secretary of state in that order. And should the president decide he wants to transfer the helm to the vice president, he will do so.
Who makes that decision, Mr.
As of
Secretary,
now, I am in control here in the White House, pending return of the vice president, and in close touch with him. If something came up, I would check with him, of course.
In a bizarre twist on the president's former career, his accused assailant claimed to have done the shooting all for the love of a movie star.
I've never met, spoken to, or in any way associated with one John W. Hinckley. Last fall, I received several pieces of unsolicited correspondence signed John W. Hinckley or JWH, and I threw them all away. This is not uncommon, as I receive a great deal of similar unsolicited correspondence.
A couple of additional quotes. This one is at 2:05 a.m. If I had this much attention in Hollywood, I'd never left. Then to a nurse, after the tubes had been removed at 3 a.m., I always heal fast. The nurse said, keep up the good work. The president said, you mean this may happen several more times?
With the support of friends, relatives, and jelly bellies, Mr. Reagan went on to a speedy and complete recovery. But much more in doubt was the condition of Press Secretary James Brady, who had suffered a bullet wound in the head. His hard-fought recovery was something of a miracle, especially considering the initial reports from all the TV networks.
The White House confirms that White House Press Secretary James Brady has died of the gunshot wounds he suffered in that shooting incident outside the Washington Hilton Hotel.
As far as the report about Jim Brady, it is untrue, and he is in serious condition.
I saw Jim. I mean, when they were taking him away in the ambulance when he was still on the ground, I just thought it couldn't happen, you know, to him.
In the days and weeks that followed, public attention was drawn increasingly to news of Jim Brady's fight for life.
Mr. Brady had become less responsive this afternoon, and a subsequent CT scan showed a significant amount of air in the brain ventricles, the inner canals of the brain, which are normally filled with spinal fluid.
After more than 4 months in the hospital, Brady went home to Arlington, Virginia. Although he had made much progress since the shooting, it was clear that a long uphill battle remained on the way to total recovery. And it was also clear that Jim Brady was ready for the fight. It seemed like we had hardly gotten over the shock of the Reagan assassination attempt when, just a few weeks later, came another near tragedy, this time in Rome. Pope John Paul was giving his weekly audience with the public when suddenly a flurry of shots rang out. The Pope had been hit.
I feel hurt. I feel afraid.
I feel as empty now as I did after President Reagan was shot.
I guess we're in the last days. It's a horrible thing to have happen.
It's dumb to shoot somebody like a great person like the Pope.
This despicable and unprovoked attack is yet another example of the wanton resort to violence and terrorism which has all too often plagued our modern society.
He has exposed himself all across the world to everybody who wishes to see him, and to reach out and touch, and the last thing he would be concerned about would be his own security.
In June, a man in a crowd fired blanks from a cartridge pistol at Queen Elizabeth. He was immediately arrested, taken into custody, and charged with intention to alarm the Queen. And finally, in October, all the threats and near misses vanished, and in their place was an ugly assassination. Egyptian President Anwar Sadat was watching a military parade when he was cut down by a group of men in soldiers' uniforms.
We hope that the peace process, despite the cruel act of its enemies, will continue. As we know, President Sadat would wish with all his heart.
The killers who survived were later put on trial, their courtroom movements restricted to a barred cage.
My great achievement, peace, for that I asked to be buried on Mount Sinai in the center of three temples. One is a mosque, the other is a church, the third is a synagogue.
Of course, there was good news this year, too, but that didn't seem to make the front pages too often. But for the record, there were continued advancements in science, medicine, and technology. The first successful heart-lung transplants were performed this year. The first American test tube baby was born. There was news of promising new treatments for breast cancer. And by means of little tiny headphones, you could roller skate and listen to the radio at the same time. Oh, and there was one other technological event. It happened back in April, and as I remember, it even got some press coverage.
7, 6, 5, 4. We've gone for main engine start. We can.
Getting up and going. John and I expected a real hard kick in the pants, call tower clear right from the cockpit. But it was actually a really very smooth liftoff.
The government is now looking at wireless mics that I think will really improve the capability of the crew to operate.
Hello?
Oh, Mr. Vice President.
How's it going up there? Everything rocking along all right? Hey, listen, I'm glad to talk to both you and Crip. How's he behaving?
The spaceship Columbia is a phenomenon. It is an incredibly amazing piece of machinery. And anytime you can take something that big and put it into space and bring it back and land it on a runway, you have just accomplished something just short of a miracle, I believe.
Columbia, this is Houston to Buckhorn. You're on energy, slightly north of ground track.
7 months later, we shot the Columbia into space again, although technical difficulties brought the mission to an early close. Still, it was the first used spacecraft to make it out of the lot.